Welcome to Arirang Special. I'm Yoon. More than 100 heads of state and government show up in person in New York for this year's United Nations General Assembly with road closures and ramped up security in that city, just like before the COVID pandemic. World leaders addressed the 78th UN General Assembly, and that includes South Korean President Yoon. We will bring you live his keynote speech in just a few moments. And as we wait for the president's speech, our correspondent Oh Soo-young is standing by near the New York headquarters. Let's turn to her now. Soo-young, good to see you. President Yoon is due to speak very soon. What can you tell us about the contents of his speech, which we expect will focus on Korea's contribution to the world?
Good morning, Tongmin. A very early morning to you. And well, yes, as you said, we're waiting for President Yoon to deliver his address to the UN General Assembly, which was expected to begin shortly. And it's really going to lay out South Korea's plans to contribute to global peace and prosperity in line with its vision to act as a responsible stakeholder in the international community. Now, President Yoon's speech is expected to focus on three core areas. Now, he's identified three global gaps, which he believes has set the world back amid times of multiple crises. Now, he's going to first reaffirm commitment to expanding support for developing countries with greater official development assistance, with the South Korean government, of course, having increased its budget for foreign aid next year by around 44%. And second, President Yoon will set out plans to close the climate gap in the climate response gap, and pledge to do more to help countries without the sufficient infrastructure or the technology necessary to withstand extreme weather events and also support their carbon-free future. Third, the president will address the growing digital divide within and between societies. Now, Yoon has long called for digital principles and an international organization that ensures sustainable and ethical advancement of technology, as well as equitable access among countries as new global norms in this rapidly changing world. He has, in fact, been building on these ideas since this time last year during the previous UN General Assembly, during which the president attended the Digital Vision Forum at New York University. And he's going to be attending the second forum on Thursday, where he's likely to further elaborate on this digital vision of his.
And Soo-young, the president will also likely touch upon geopolitical concerns.
Yes, as you said, of course, he's already held a meeting with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres on Tuesday on North Korea's nuclear threat, as well as Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. Now, South Korea's growing interest and role in the Indo-Pacific region's security, as well as global security, is becoming all the more vital as the country will become a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council next year for a 2-year term. Thus, President Yoon has pledged to lay out how South Korea aims to contribute to the exclusive security group, and in particular will be looking to ramp up support for South Korea's position on responding to North Korea's growing provocations.
And of course, the president is likely to mention Busan's bid to host the 2030 World Expo. He's continuing to hold dozens of bilateral meetings while there. How are those going?
Right, yes. Well, as we saw, he's been on an endless back-to-back summitry, this real marathon of bilaterals during his time here. And he's expected to have met with more than 40 world leaders by the time he leaves New York on Friday. And while Principal Deputy National Security Advisor Kim Tae-ho told reporters in a briefing on Tuesday that the president's engagement with other countries has brought about an understanding of South Korea's capabilities and qualifications in holding the World Expo 2030 in Busan, with his counterparts really expressing their hope for a positive outcome for Korea. Now, Yoon has reached out to development partners around the world who are mostly based in Africa and Central and South America, and these include countries that South Korea has never before held summits with. So his officials have told us that President Yoon has actually taken the opportunity to expand South Korea's diplomatic network. And upon engaging them, he's not taking a general one-size-fits-all approach, but he's actually sharing the significance of South Korea holding the Expo in Busan within the context of each country that he's engaging with. For instance, Yoon would discuss the country's needs for infrastructure, for instance, or climate response based on South Korea's own experience. In fact, to really go above and beyond and adding his personal touch, a bar of South Korean chocolate called Kana was actually incorporated into the dessert dish when President Yoon met with his counterpart from Ghana, as he even presented the dessert on a dish that had "Busan has everything" engraved on it.
Well, there will be a lot to digest from his speech later. Thanks for the coverage, Soo-young. And for a closer look, I'm joined by Professor Mason Ritchie from Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Thank you for your time. Good to see you, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
South Korean President Yoon is attending in person and will address the UN chamber. This is the second year in a row for him. Last year, his first keynote speech centered around freedom and solidarity. What do we expect to hear from him this year?
Yeah, so I think, obviously the first thing, as we just saw, is we're going to see him focus on these global gaps, the gap in the rhetoric on climate change versus the actual ability to marshal the resources among states to solve the problems that are associated with climate change. In the second place, the digital divide, and in particular, Yoon is really interested in setting up a body to deal with digital governance, a body that would perhaps be housed within the United Nations, and that would focus on digital norms and principles covering everything from cybersecurity to artificial intelligence, because of the connectivity and the immediacy that these emerging technologies have for us. And then again, the sustainable development goals and meeting the development needs of the countries that are, the vast majority of those who are in the United Nations General Assembly. On top of that, obviously, we're going to get some mention of North Korea, obviously, and I would expect that he'll put that not only in terms of the threat actually from North Korea itself, but also how that fits in with the universal nature of United Nations Security Council sanctions against North Korea, and the fact that North Korea is in breach of those is not just a problem for South Korea or the United States, but is a problem for the United Nations as a multilateral institution as a whole. And then I think, of course, we can expect on the sidelines, obviously, Yoon to really try to sell Busan for the Expo 2030, and he'll have meetings with leaders about various issues. He'll obviously has already met with UN General Assembly Secretary General Gutierrez also. So some of the North Korea issues, for instance, will be handled perhaps more directly in those closed-door sessions rather than in the General Assembly itself.
A lot of topics there. And building upon what you have just said, to what extent do you think President Yoon will address North Korea in front of world leaders? Because there has been recent Kim Jong-un-Putin summit, given the current geopolitical circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, I think he'll obviously bring that up in some form or another. How directly that addresses the particularities of the threat from North Korea is something that's unknown to me. I don't actually know the text of his speech. I would think that the direct threat that North Korea represents would be something that would be better handled in the bilateral meetings that Yoon has had with Biden and with Gutierrez, and that Yoon will have with other leaders who he meets. But of course, it's going to come up in his General Assembly speech. What I think probably you'll see in terms of the framing for that is talking about how North Korea's violations of sanctions, North Korea's violations of international law are an affront to the rules-based international order as such, and therefore it's not just North Korea that's violating its obligations vis-a-vis not threatening South Korea or the United States or Japan or other regional states here in Northeast Asia, but also the United Nations as a whole. And so I think that's one of the ways that you're going to see this framed.
And what does North Korea expect, do you think, to gain from the recent meeting between Kim Jong-un and Putin, and vice versa?
Yeah, so this was obviously a hot topic, over the last 2 weeks or so, and we think that Kim has just gotten back from his visit to Russia. So in the first place, I think what we're seeing is the concretization of a tighter cooperation between Pyongyang and its regional partners. We know about, of course, the relationship between Pyongyang and Beijing, which, rocky though it sometimes can be, is nonetheless an actual, real treaty-based alliance, even if it's one where there's not a lot of trust, perhaps between the leaders or between the states. But now we're seeing Pyongyang get closer to Moscow, and so we're seeing in that regard, I think, perhaps the first look at a sort of bloc that's forming, a trilateral bloc potentially, where there are some synergies between some of the malign interests of Pyongyang, Beijing, and Moscow vis-a-vis the United States, South Korea, and Japan, which are, of course, tightening their trilateral cooperation mechanisms very substantially recently. So I think that's one thing that we're seeing. And then, of course, the quid pro quo.
Apologies, Professor. I have to cut you off there. I will turn things over to the United Nations General Assembly Hall, where President Yoon is making his keynote speech.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale, j'ai l'honneur de souhaiter la bienvenue.
I have the honor to welcome His Excellency Mr. Yoon Suk-yeol, President of the Republic of Korea, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished delegates, I extend my congratulations to His Excellency Dennis Francis on assuming the presidency of the 78th session of the General Assembly. Let me also pay tribute to Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his dedication to global peace and prosperity. This year marks the 70th anniversary of the Korean War armistice. After the invasion by communist totalitarian forces, the fate of the Republic of Korea hung in the balance. Thankfully, with the support of UN forces, the nation dramatically defended its freedom. The determined decision of the first UN Secretary General Choi Lee viewed the armed invasion against the Republic of Korea as a challenge to world peace. His leading role in convening the Security Council and adopting a resolution to intervene in the war remains deeply ingrained in the minds of the Korean people. Over the past 70 years, Korea has risen from the ashes of war to blossom into a liberal democracy and a market economy. Now Korea intends to responsibly contribute to the international community with a goal to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom as championed in the UN Charter. The theme of the 78th session of the General Assembly is rebuilding trust and reigniting global solidarity. The war in Ukraine that has been going on for 2 years has deepened the division in values and ideologies within the international community. Additionally, the economic repercussions of the COVID-19 pandemic has been exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, causing a contraction in the global economy and leading to food and energy crises in many parts of the world. In difficult times, it is the vulnerable who suffer more. In the face of today's multifaceted global crises of an unprecedented scale, divides among securities are widening across various areas, including security, economy, technology, health, environment, and culture. To narrow these divides and ensure harmonious coexistence among all nations, the international community must stand united with the UN at its core. Today, I wish to address the divide issue in 3 key areas: in the development divide, climate divide, and digital divide. Many countries around the world still lack the essential infrastructure necessary for everyday living. Development is unattainable without basic infrastructure such as water and sewage systems to process and supply drinking and daily use water, energy facilities to provide electricity, and health care facilities to treat the sick. To narrow the development divide, countries with financial and technological capacities must assume responsible roles. Korea is set to boldly increase its official development assistance volume. Despite this year's fiscal austerity measures, the Korean government has raised the ODA budget plan for the upcoming year by over 40%. As a result, compared to the fiscal year of 2019, Korea's ODA budget is expected to more than double by next year. We will allocate the increased ODA funds to foster development cooperation tailored to the needs of our partner countries. In particular, we will actively channel our ODA efforts into education and training to help partner countries build the capacity to progress economically and socially on their own. It is said that a year of education can increase income by approximately 10%. This impact is more pronounced among low-income groups and women. We must expand these benefits on a global scale. The climate crisis is another challenge that exacerbates the economic divide between nations and impedes humanity's sustainable development. This past July, we experienced the hottest summer ever recorded on Earth. On this boiling Earth, extreme weather events such as heat waves, torrential rains, and typhoons have become the norm. Climate change is causing geopolitical shifts in agriculture and fisheries, worsening the crises in countries vulnerable to food shortages. To assist countries vulnerable to climate change in reducing their carbon emissions and accelerating their transition to clean energy, Korea will scale up its green ODA. In particular, we will contribute an additional $300 million to the Green Climate Fund. We anticipate the international community's active financial support for the Green Climate Fund. We also hope that the international community's collective resolve to bridge the climate divide would lead to tangible actions. Korea will not only harness renewable energy, but also extensively employ high-efficiency carbon-free energy, such as nuclear power and hydrogen, as a realistic measure to hasten our pursuit of carbon neutrality. We also plan to share these energy sources with countries vulnerable to climate change, ensuring they too can benefit. To this end, Korea aims to pursue an international global joint research on carbon-free energy and facilitate technological innovation and investments from the private sector. Moreover, Korea will launch a carbon-free alliance, an open platform that anyone in the world can join to promote the adoption of carbon-free energy. Next, Korea plans to play a leading role in bridging the digital divide, utilizing our strengths in information and communications technologies. Today, with advancements in digital technology, cultures and industries are shifting towards digital-based paradigms. The digital divide is a major cause of economic divide. Therefore, bridging the digital divide will be a positive attribute in resolving the challenges faced by the global South. Korea will support the digital transformation of countries with limited digital penetration and utilization. This will enhance their citizens' access to education, healthcare, and financial services. Last September at New York University and last June at the Sorbonne in Paris, I stressed that digital advancements can only be achieved when fair access to AI and digital technologies, as well as the safe use of digital technologies, are ensured. I have also proposed the establishment of an international organization under the UN to discuss and set forth rules regarding digital ethics. If we fail to curb the spread of fake news resulting from the misuse of AI and digital technologies, our freedom will be at risk, the market economy anchored in liberal democracy will be in peril, and our very future will be under threat. Korea plans to introduce a digital Bill of Rights soon to put forth a desirable future of the digital order. To support the creation of an international organization under the UN and provide concrete directions for the development of AI governance, the Korean government plans to host the Global AI Forum. Furthermore, we plan to collaborate closely with the high-level advisory body on AI being established by the UN to provide a network for communication and collaboration among global experts. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished delegates, without international peace and security, development and prosperity remain elusive. During my visit to Kyiv last July, I saw the sorrow in the eyes of children being treated at the National Children's Hospital. Children are our future, yet children are oftentimes the first victims of war. In line with our commitment to the Ukraine Peace and Solidarity Initiative, the Korean government will implement a comprehensive support program that encompasses security, humanitarian assistance, and reconstruction. Furthermore, as I pledged at the G20 summit just 2 weeks ago, Korea will actively support Ukraine's reconstruction by providing $300 million next year and a mid to long-term support package exceeding $2 billion. The nuclear and missile programs of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea pose not only a direct and existential threat to the peace of the Republic of Korea, but also is a serious challenge to peace in the Indo-Pacific region and across the globe. It is paradoxical that a permanent member of the UN Security Council, entrusted as the ultimate guardian of world peace, would wage war by invading another sovereign nation and receive arms and ammunition from the regime that blatantly violates UN Security Council resolutions. In such a situation, the call to reform the UN Security Council would receive a broad support. And if the DPRK acquires the information and technology necessary to enhance its WMD capabilities in exchange for supporting Russia with conventional weapons, the deal will be a direct provocation threatening the peace and security of not only Ukraine, but also the Republic of Korea. The Republic of Korea, together with its allies and partners, will not stand idly by. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished delegates, while military strength may vary among countries, by uniting in unwavering solidarity and steadfastly adhering to principles, we can deter any unlawful provocation. As a member of the UN Security Council for the 2024 to 2025 term, the Republic of Korea commits to playing a responsible role in promoting and building global peace as we work closely with fellow UN member states. Passing on to future generations an international order grounded in justice and the rule of law, along with sustainable freedom, peace, and prosperity, is a historic responsibility shared by all of us who are here today. The Republic of Korea, together with the United Nations, shall readily take on this responsibility. distinguished delegates. The Republic of Korea aspires to host the World Expo 2030 to fulfill its responsibility and contribute to the international community. It was Busan that served as the last bastion defending the freedom of the Republic of Korea when the most of the country was invaded and conquered by the communist forces more than 70 years ago. It was also Busan that rose from the ruins of the Korean War and became the second largest transshipment hub in the world, leading the miracle on the Han River. Without Busan, Korea would not have been able to stand where it is today. Now the Republic of Korea will play its role as a responsible member of the global community by hosting the 2030 Expo in Busan, a gateway that links the Eurasian continent and the Pacific. Korea intends to give back to the international community by sharing its experience of economic growth and development, reciprocating the help it has received in the past. In 1851, the London Expo in 1851 was an expo of the Industrial Revolution. The 1990 Paris Expo was an expo of culture. The 1962 Seattle Expo was an expo which opened the new space era. The 2000 Hanover Expo was an expo of the environment. The 2030 Busan Expo will be an expo of the solidarity. The basis of Korea's foreign policy is freedom and solidarity. Building upon these values, the 2030 Busan Expo will serve as a platform of solidarity through which the world citizens can overcome crises and spread freedom together. The Busan Expo will be a festival where all nations can come together to share their history, culture, goods, and visions for the future, and will significantly contribute to the freedom, peace, and prosperity of the citizens around the globe. Thank you.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale, je tiens à remercier le président.
Right, that was President Yoon addressing the UN chamber. Joining me now is Mr. Bruce Klinger, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation from Washington, D.C. Good to see you. Thanks for joining us. So what are major takeaways from South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol's UN speech?
I thought it was a very good speech. I might have thought he would lead with the security threats, both from North Korea and the deal with Russia as well as Ukraine. But I thought it was much more masterful to first remind the UN that this is the 70th anniversary of the UN response to North Korean aggression in 1950. President Yoon highlighted the 70th year of the anniversary, or the 70th anniversary of the alliance during his April speech to Congress. And here I think it was very important to remind the UN of its actions against North Korean aggression and then sort of by inference the Chinese and Russian support of that aggression. And then it also I thought was quite masterful to lay out all the things that really a long menu of things that South Korea will provide to the world on the three major divides that he talked of, really showing once again that South Korea is a very small country but punches far above its weight on the international stage. And then having laid that groundwork, the foundation of all of South Korea's accomplishments and pledges, then he turned to the security threats. So, but then finished with again, promises to the international community and pledges to work with the community. So I thought overall, I thought it was a very masterful speech.
Right, and correct me if I'm wrong. I believe North Korean representatives were absent as President Yoon Suk-yeol was speaking, and the Russian delegation representatives were there. And President Yoon said it's paradoxical, weird to see a permanent UN Security Council member invade another country and receive arms from a regime that violates UNSC resolutions. And he said he warned against any weapons-related information flowing into North Korea. What do you read into his message?
Well, I thought that was a masterful way of sort of twisting the knife in pointing out how terrible that deal is. It's not just a security threat, but it really shows how Russia's behavior as a member of the UN Security Council, supposedly the guarantor of international peace, it certainly shows the hypocrisy of Moscow's actions, as well as, again, emphasizing North Korea's repeated violations of the UN Security Council resolutions. So I thought that was also quite well done.
And what's the atmosphere in Washington about the recent summit between North Korea's Kim Jong-un and Russia's Vladimir Putin?
There's great concern. Obviously, the first focus is on the military implications, where if North Korea provides significant amounts of artillery, as it's reported that it did last year to Russia, that will enable Moscow to continue its atrocities and its aggression in Ukraine in defiance of the international community's condemnation. Also, the concern that in return North Korea may receive economic benefits or even military technology from Russia. All of that would violate international resolutions, and it also would water down the enforcement of the international sanctions against North Korea as well as Russia. So there's a great deal of concern, not only in the military aspect, but that it's a way of effectively evading international sanctions.
The South Korean leader is keen on addressing global concerns like the Ukraine war and closing divides in three key areas: development, climate, and digital sector, as he mentioned in his speech. How do you assess South Korea's pledge to play a responsible role as part of the international community?
I think his listing, really a long list of promises as well as accomplishments already by South Korea, really affirms his pledge for Korea to become a global pivotal state and for Seoul to play a larger role in the Indo-Pacific region as well as globally. And in the last 2 years, we've seen South Korean participation or attendance at the NATO summit, as well as the Asia-Pacific 4 summit in Europe during the NATO summit. And that really shows a growing coordination between the European and Asian theaters that has really been, I think, accelerated because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We see sort of common threats linking the two major theaters, which were often seen as quite separate in the past.
And Mr. Klinger, before I let you go, this year, President Biden is the only leader to attend from the permanent 5 UN Security Council members as Washington seeks to expand the UNSC to rein in the veto powers of Russia and China. What are the chances that this reform will happen?
Well, expanding the UN Security Council, as some have tried to do, I think will be difficult. I'm not sure Russia and China would accede to that. But I think Biden's attendance was to underscore the importance that the United States sees in the international community and the United Nations, and also seeking the community to work together against common threats as well as challenges, which can be economic and climate and digital. So we hope that it's seen as the United States, stressing its role in the international community as well as seeking to lead others towards common goals.
All right, Mr. Bruce Klinger, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, thank you for your insights.
Well, thank you for having me.
And now to you, Professor Ritchie. So what stood out to you?
Some of the same things that Mr. Klinger just mentioned, as I made a note to myself.
Yes.
As he was speaking. I completely agree with Mr. Klinger that opening the speech with an homage and a thank you to the United Nations for sending forces in 1950 to support South Korea in pushing back against North Korean invasion, and saying that the armistice that eventually was signed in 1953 was only possible, and therefore the continuation of South Korean Republic was only possible because the United Nations was there. I thought that was a very nice move. Rhetorically, and again, I agree with Mr. Klinger that I thought it was very nice to start, after that sort of initial introduction, to start by talking about the things that are really of interest to the vast majority of states who are in the United Nations General Assembly. Right? When we tend to think of the United Nations, we tend to think of the Security Council and primarily security-related issues and sanctions and that sort of thing, and peace and security. And of course, those are important, very important, obviously. But for the vast majority of states in the United Nations General Assembly, they're concerned about economic development, they're concerned about social development, they're concerned about environmental problems, they're concerned about poverty, they're concerned about food. And so starting with these development issues, access to digital services, and climate change, I think is a savvy move, because it's laying out something that's important for those states and not simply coming to the table at the UN and saying, here are the things that South Korea thinks is important, I'm going to talk about them. Obviously, those are important to South Korea, but it's important to lay out these things that are important for the other states who you're going to need to support you when you're there on the Security Council, and you're going to need them to support you when you're asking them to vote for Busan to become the host of the Expo in 2030. So I thought that was really good as well. Obviously, he's setting up the time that South Korea is going to spend on the Security Council as a non-permanent voting, as a non-permanent member. I thought that the Busan Expo part at the end was fine. I would say that's maybe my one little negative point from the speech. He ended by seemingly arguing that the Busan Expo was going to help solve a lot of world problems, which seems to me like maybe you're overselling a little bit exactly what this Expo might be able to accomplish. I mean, it's a nice event, but I don't think that we're going to solve world hunger or climate change simply because Busan has the Expo in 2030. So I think he might have oversold that a little bit.
Interesting. And perhaps in line with that, President Yoon mentioned closing divides, vowing for more budget and funding for ODA projects and expanding carbon-free energy. So this comes despite the Korean government tightening its belt next year. What grabbed your attention?
So as far as that's concerned, I think, again, he does a really nice job in the speech of laying out some synergies between what South Korea can bring to the table. Obviously, South Korea is a very important player in infrastructure. Right? There's lots of engineering and construction firms in Korea that have great expertise there, and that filters, of course, into government and the agencies here in Korea that help coordinate some of that on the international level, such as KOICA. And so I think that it's he's talking about something that's important for the vast majority of countries that are in the General Assembly that are still developing nations, and he's talking about something that's essentially a strength of South Korea. I think that's one thing. The second thing, talking about increasing the official development assistance budget. Obviously South Korea is one of the few countries that has gone from being a development assistance recipient to a development assistance donor. So I think that the background of this increase in ODA is an interesting one, and sends a message out to other countries that it is possible through intelligent policies, which should be tailored to each country's individual needs, of course, and endowments. That countries can in fact achieve the development goals that they would like to have, and over time, those who do succeed should, like Korea, take on a greater role in terms of international solidarity and not kicking the ladder out from under them to prevent other countries from climbing up, but in fact holding that ladder so that other countries can continue to climb up. On the climate part, he talked quite a bit about high efficiency, energy production, and the one non-carbon energy that he mentioned, of course, was nuclear. And here I'll just say, I don't think that anyone in that room, and probably most people who are watching who know much about the government here and the things that they're interested in terms of the energy sector, will overlook the fact that this is perhaps not only a good way, indeed, through using nuclear energy to bridge from fossil fuels to a sustainable energy production, but also this conveniently is something that South Korea is interested in commercially as well, insofar as it wants to export nuclear reactors all over the world. So clearly behind that statement, with all of his good intentions, there's something there for Korean business as well.
And I noticed him mentioning fighting fake news, as he mentioned AI and digital technology. What do you read into his message? That's a rather political one, I'd say.
Yeah, this fits in, I think, with his larger focus on some of these kinds of intangible human experiences that come under the peace and prosperity and solidarity kind of rhetoric, and the rhetoric of freedom that he's adopted since he's come into office. And I think the idea here is, societies can't govern themselves if they don't have the correct set, or I'm not going to say correct, but if they don't have facts that are more or less the basis of their foundation for making decisions. We can disagree about policies. We can disagree about opinions. We can have arguments about the best way to reach objectives. We can have arguments about what those objectives should be. But we do need to all have a basis more or less in facts. If some of us think that the sky is yellow and the sun is blue, and some of us think the reverse, it doesn't really matter the form of argumentation that you end up taking. You're not going to have a productive discussion about how your politics and your society are going to try to sculpt the experience of individuals within states. And so I think obviously the problem with fake news is that you end up creating what we famously heard referred to in the United States at one point as alternative facts, which is to say things that aren't facts at all. So I think he's pointing actually interestingly to one of the important foundations for democracy, which is to say we do need to have at least some basic shared sets of facts, and fake news is a fundamental risk in that regard. So I think that's one of the things that's going on in that statement.
And Professor, how do you assess President Yoon's renewed pledge to help Ukraine? Where does that put South Korea on the global stage?
So the first thing that I noticed there, and I think Mr. Klingner earlier sort of referred to that as well, the extent to which we're seeing increasing overlap between security concerns in Europe and security concerns in the Indo-Asia Pacific. 3 years ago, I don't think anyone would have thought that South Korea would have had such a potentially important role to play in Ukraine, and yet it does through its own military assistance, which is indirect, of course, to Ukraine, at least in terms of lethal aid, but the indirect assistance that countries like South Korea can provide on the one hand, also obviously the diplomatic support, and of course the $300 million of humanitarian assistance that South Korea is going to be offering, on top of $2 billion in loans that will be made available starting in 2024, 2025, if I remember correctly. So this fits in with the rhetoric of global pivotal state and South Korea punching above its weight. And then on the other hand, the extent to which we see the Ukraine file hurting South Korea, which is to say, insofar as Russia may well be purchasing and likely has purchased weapons from North Korea ends up coming out of that strengthened as well, which of course is a threat to South Korea. So the way that we see the security concerns in East Asia or the larger Indo-Pacific beginning to bleed over into European security concerns and the reverse is, I think, one of the major things that I take away from this speech. It's a really solidification of something that we've kind of seen happening slowly, but here's Yoon really acknowledging it.
And let's talk about security issues. President Yoon apparently took aim at Russia. He said it's weird, it's paradoxical to see a permanent UNSC member invade another country and receive arms from a regime that blatantly violates UNSC resolutions. What does South Korea expect from the international community to address related security concerns?
I'll be honest with you, I don't know what the Yoon administration or South Korea as a whole would expect from the international community in this regard. I'll start by saying something I guess that's a little bit unhappy, and that is, many of the countries in the world have other more important, or shall I say, perhaps more pressing and immediate concerns than dealing with Ukraine. There are countries in South America, there are countries throughout the Middle East and Central Asia, certainly countries in Africa, who may well think that what is happening in Ukraine is tragic, and they may lament the violation of the United Nations Charter and of United Nations Security Council principles that Russia has engaged in so brazenly and so blatantly. But this is not a top priority for them because they have other things that they have to worry about, whether it be political instability or health and development concerns. And so, there's, I think, not a lot of appetite among UN General Assembly members to put extraordinary pressure on a country like Russia simply because they have other things that they have to worry about. That being said, of course, I wouldn't necessarily say that what Russia's doing is paradoxical. It's much worse. It's hypocritical. Russia has a veto as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and it's using it to essentially block any attempt to try to punish it through UN multilateral mechanisms. And there, I think what you see Yoon doing astutely is to remind the international community, and obviously those who are allied with South Korea already know it, but to remind these other countries in the UN General Assembly that it is the case that the integrity of the multilateral process at the United Nations is important. That starts with the UN Charter and that starts with the UN Security Council. And so if Russia violates that blatantly, then at what point does that start to become a domino that affects other countries as well? And so I think he's reminding them that they're playing with fire by not paying attention to the Security Council in this regard. The other thing, of course, that he's perhaps pointing to in some ways is the possibility of reform of the Security Council. I don't expect there to be any reform on veto. That's just not a power that the permanent 5 members are willing to give away. Certainly not Russia and China, but for that matter, I don't see the United States, the UK, or France wanting to give away those incredibly valuable vetoes that they have as permanent members of the Security Council. But we might perhaps see some reform on the margins of the Security Council, such as increasing the size perhaps a little bit, or perhaps increasing the number of years that a country stays on the Security Council. And I'll just note that in the case of South Korea, it's at an interesting moment where it's going to be joining as a non-permanent member starting in 2024. And it's going to have 1 year where it overlaps with Japan. So in the context of the trilateral cooperation tightening that's happening with the U.S., Japan, and South Korea, I think there's some synergy there. There's also some other friendly countries that are going to be on there at the time, such as I believe Slovenia or Slovakia, one of the two, also Switzerland, and along with the U.S., the UK, and France, there's a significant block of countries that gets you almost to the 9 out of the 15 you need out of the total UN Security Council to place items on the agenda. So I think that there's a real chance to be able to move some issues onto the Security Council agenda, even if the vote that might happen on them doesn't go the way that you would want because one of the P5 members would use a veto. Putting things on the agenda as a part of naming and shaming or publicizing issues is an important thing that you can do. So.
All right, from Mason Ritchie, Professor of International Politics at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, thank you for your insights.
Great, thanks for joining me. Thanks for having me. It's late at night.
It is. And that wraps up Arirang News Special. Thank you for watching.
멋있죠? 나는 그림 그리고 싶다. 네, 파스텔 그리면 너무 예쁘겠다.